All right, we are the 5M's band, the mostly mediocre musical Monarch Mariposa band here. And well, you'll find out more about us. So you guys ready?
Before I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away. I'll fly away.
All right, so this is a song about those monarchs who migrate. All the obstacles that they face on their migration, we're just glad that they continue to be willing to take the trip. I've been caught by the rain, hit by the jam, torn and tattered, but I'm on my way and I'm still going. Tore up my toaster late last night, got stuck on
willing to be moving.
Some folks know I won't go to Mexico. That's how my East Coast cousins avoid the snow. Still living. Children will be born and they'll fly away, but future generations will go back someday. Still living.
I've been from Salem to Sacramento, to Noma to Santa Cruz. I've been walking the desert so I can go back. Stay on the back roads, I won't get smashed.
And if you give me
Milkweed and bright sunshine, and you show me a sign, I'll be willing to be moving.
time again that I've got the great in the milkweed patch where we've been
Still willing.
children will be born and they'll fly away, but future generations will come back someday.
Still willing. I've been from Salem to Sacramento, to Noma to Santa Cruz. I've been walking the desert so I can go back. Stay on the back roads so I can get smashed.
And if you give me
Milkweed and bright sunshine, then you show me a sign, I'll be willing to be moving. I'll be willing.
once more, we're the 5M's band. That's the mostly mediocre musical monarch Mariposas, and for decades we have been singing songs about monarch Mariposas, often songs that you used to enjoy before we got to them. But it doesn't stop us from singing about and talking about monarch butterflies.
I got clouds of air on a sunny day, and I'm sad when they're gone by the month of May. I guess you'd say, what can make me feel this way? Monarchs talking about monarchs. I got so much nectar, the bees envy me. I gotta sing a song because they're in the tree. Hey, 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 hey. I guess you'd say, what can make me feel this way? Monarchs talking about monarchs. I don't think I'll swallow that or on the fancy breeze. Talking about monarchs. Talking about monarchs. Talking about monarchs.
I see them out there in the trees and don't need no birds, don't need no bees and you ought to come from near and far to participate in this seminar. While they're out doing their migration, we join the California State Parks Foundation. Talking about monarchs.
Woo! All right, thank you, Ems.
Stage right.
Thanks for letting us sing.
All right. All right, well, welcome everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you, Heather. Hi, Bill. It's good to see you. And gosh, we have so many people showing up today. I first want to just thank my band members from the 5Ms band, the Mostly Mediocre Musical Monarch Mariposas. We've been singing music about the Monarchs for well into 25 years now. My name is Randy Wadera, and I am the Director of Philanthropy here at the California State Parks Foundation. And we are excited today to present to you our Monarch Insider Series. Let me get set up here, and we will begin soon. So, there we are, in a grove amongst the monarchs, just where we want to be, right? So I want you to make sure to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're from. It's great to see all of you that have shown up. And I want to talk a little bit about the webinar today. What we're going to be doing is using, if you have questions, we will have time for questions near the end. So there is a Q&A function that's in the bottom of your Zoom meeting. And so please use that to ask your questions so that our people in the background, David and Ashley and Sydney, they will be feeding me the questions when the question and answer time comes. So please use that Q&A button down there. Okay, we also ask that you will be remained muted throughout the webinar. And be respectful in all your comments to your fellow folks on the webinar, as well as to the speakers through the whole time. But I think you're going to have a good time. Again, thank you for joining us for this first Insider Speaker Series. These virtual events are a benefit for members and donors of California State Parks Foundation, so you can learn more about the work that we are doing in state parks and with state parks. You will hear from experts in the field who will give multiple perspectives on a topic. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit now about what we're going to do over the next hour. We're going to start off by introducing our panelists who have some prepared remarks. They'll each take about 5 minutes to talk about their specific work that they're doing with California State Parks and monarch butterfly conservation. Then I have a couple of prepared remarks for folks, and then we'll go into the open Q&A. And again, putting those questions in the Q&A function is what we'd like you to do. All right, let's get started. Again, you know, monarch butterflies, they symbolize joy, endurance, hope, and life. They are a charismatic migratory pollinator that connects people from all walks of life to nature, and we see it every day in the monarch groves. But to survive, monarchs need a healthy landscape filled with a diversity of nectar sources and milkweed, which is their signature host plant. Western monarchs migrate and cluster to the coastal overwintering sites here along the California coast, and many of those sites are located in California state parks. Actually, a majority of monarchs do cluster in these California state parks, and that's one of the reasons why California state parks play such a significant role in monarch conservation. In the 1980s, there was an estimated 4.5 million butterflies. Imagine that migrated However, by the mid 2010s, the population has declined to 200 to 300,000 butterflies. And in both 2018 and 2019, volunteers counted under 30,000 monarchs, less than 1% of the population's historic size. It's been a rapid decline. And as many of us know that in 2020, it was even more dire. There were little over 2,000 monarchs. And so we have been working with state parks on different conservation, but the call to action was definitely dire. Just a little bit about my personal relationship. I started working for state parks 35 years ago at Natural Bridges. And my job was bringing kids to the tide pools and the monarch grove. And so I early on got a chance to work with kids, and over the course of 12 years would run hundreds of kids through the monarch grove and watch the magic of the monarchs help them just discover their own connection with nature. It was amazing. I went on to work for the Friends of Santa Cruz State Parks and become a docent. And we partnered with the California State Parks Foundation because even back in 2008, it was clear that these groves were playing a significant role in the conservation of monarchs. And so the question is, when is the best time to plant a tree, right? Well, 50 years ago or 20 years ago. But what you can see here is this was a foundation sponsored event, Earth Day in 2008. And we planted oaks and cypress trees. And on the right, you can see where those trees have grown. And what was important about this was that a lot of the trees in the grove were dying and wind was getting in. So we planted these trees, and it takes time. But that's the importance of ongoing stewardship, not just to think about it as a one-time event, but this long-time care and this long-time thinking about how can we really make a difference. And you're going to hear from Heather, Bill, and Mia, and they are the ones. They are the stewards of these groves and have been doing so much to protect them. I want to introduce our first speaker, who is Heather White, as a senior environmental scientist for California State Parks Natural Resources Division, a wildlife program. Heather is a senior scientist on the wildlife management team in California State Parks Natural Resources Division, recognized the importance of California State Park lands to Western monarchs. She leads the Natural Resources Division's partnership with nonprofit organizations, consulting groups, and district staff to assess, prioritize, and plan for the management and restoration of these monarch overwintering groves across 6 parks district. Heather, you have a big job. We're looking forward to hearing from you and from your comments. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Randy. And thank you to the foundation for giving me a chance to come and talk about the work that we've been doing. It's like you were saying, state parks does play a pretty big role in monarch conservation on the coast of California. And so, so my day-to-day work, I'm on the statewide wildlife management team, as Randy mentioned, up here at headquarters. So I tend to be involved in a lot of policy decisions and kind of the broader work of wildlife issues that cover multiple district boundaries. But really the on-the-ground work is done by our environmental scientists in the districts. And a lot of all the work that I do is just a huge collaborative effort with all of the district staff across the state. They've been so great to work with in all of these districts. So state parks manages a pretty significant amount of overwintering sites for monarchs along the California coast. We are pretty important to the Western monarch population. And when I talk about overwintering sites, I'm really talking about the sites as defined by the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. If you go on their website, they have a pretty great database that shows all of the overwintering sites, current and historical. And if you dig into that database, you'll find quite a few of them are on state parks lands. And, you know, Randy mentioned it a little bit. We're talking about overwintering monarchs. And, you know, for anyone who doesn't know, I mean, overwintering is basically just what it sounds like. It's where the monarchs spend the winter months, you know, as a migratory species. That's basically their strategy for surviving the winter months is they migrate to the California coast. It has a nice mild climate for them. They come, you know, every fall to the overwintering sites, and they stick around until around February, which I mean, it sounds pretty great to me. I would like to go to the coast on the every winter. So I think it's a pretty smart strategy that they've come up with over the eons or however long it's been that they've evolved this approach. So since State Parks manages such a large number of overwintering sites, we consider them in our land management work. Specifically back in 2018, the California legislature passed some funding through the Monarch Butterfly and Pollinator Rescue Program. And we partnered with the Xerces Society, and we've been working specifically with Emma Pelton over there at the Xerces Society quite a bit. And we partnered to work on a grant to try and get some of that money to help us with our on the ground stewardship work for these overwintering sites. And in 2019, we were awarded a Wildlife Conservation Board grant to do that work. And so since then, we've started doing actual on the ground conservation and restoration projects. We've, you know, I'm going to start out at the beginning with site assessments. So in some of the districts, we're just straight up doing site assessments, getting a feel for the baseline status of where the groves are and how they're doing. In other areas, we've done the site assessments and we've started on site management plans. I know that like Bill, for instance, has been involved in some of the site management plans. Again, Emma Pelton with Xerces has been instrumental, excuse me, in getting those site management plans going. And then, you know, in some districts, we've been able to actually start doing some on the ground restoration in these groves. And that's, you know, that's the most exciting part for me and for a lot of our district staff. We've been getting in there and doing some tree trimming and tree removal as necessary, planting some nectar resources, tree planting when appropriate, and we've been installing some interpretive panels. So a lot of the work that we've done up till now has been in Andrew Molera State Park, Leo Carrillo State Park, San Clemente State Beach has started, and we're just beginning. We have quite a few planned for 2023. So it's an exciting time to be involved in monarch work in state parks. And you know, since we've started, additional funding sources and partners have added on. So we've gotten more funding from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We've been partnering with resource conservation districts, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, other private companies and nonprofit partners, and including State Parks Foundation. The foundation has directly funded a couple of different of the plans, the site restoration plans that are in process right now down in the San Luis Obispo Coast District. So it's been great to have that support because that district has a lot of overwintering sites, and we're able to do a lot more work with that funding. And so it's been a super collaborative effort, and it's been a really good project, and it's been exciting to see all the work that we've been doing.
Thank you, Heather, for all your leadership. It's great working with you and your staff throughout the California State Parks. Have been amazing. Our next speaker is a dear friend, Mia Monroe, who is the Marin Community Liaison for the National Park Service in Golden Gate National Recreation, often known as Mia. Mia's had a lot of roles in national parks, but Mia's the Xerces Society volunteer who sort of has overseen the monarch counts and monitoring monarchs for over 30 years. So she helps coordinate the butterfly overwintering counts. And Mia, take it away. Unmute, Mia.
Thank you, Randy. And what Heather was saying about the work up and down the state is truly inspiring. And I got to meet Heather a few Sundays ago and welcome her as a Western Monarch Count monitor. So thanks for stepping up there on Angel Island, Heather. As Randy said, my day job is as a National Park Ranger. I work with my state park colleagues on the One Tam Collaborative in Marin County and as a monitor throughout the state. But I speak to you today as a volunteer. After an inventory of overwintering sites in the early 1990s, many of us noticed changes both in the numbers of monarchs, a serious continuing decline, and also at the sites, some serious losses. So we stand up a monitoring program now managed by the Xerces Society and composed of community scientists, volunteers. We track up and down the state of California. It's now known as the Western Monarch Count, is in its 26th formal year. The focus is on the Thanksgiving count, now underway. Monitors, volunteers are out there at this very moment, scouting, counting, looking, focusing. This documents the overwintering monarchs, the ones that have migrated from inland breeding habitat to coastal refuges. 6 years ago, a New Year's count was added. Why so much interest in monarchs? Well, sure, beauty, connection to rhythms of the seasons and life, and many in North America have had a profound experience with monarch butterflies. And that motivates us to wonder, to care, to observe, and to want to help, especially one is witness to the decline and possible disappearance, as that graph that was up a moment ago shared. But last year, and so far this year, there's been a bounce. In the graph, if you were looking at it carefully, you saw, okay, here's our graph. And if you look closely at the far bottom right, you can see what our Western Monarch Count data shows, almost disappearance and now a bounce. And let's go back to that slide of the pine, just the 4 slides would be fine. That's right. If you look at the far right there, you see what monitors are now seeing, monarchs clustering. And on the left is a monitor undergoing the first job of, can I find monarchs? Will this be the year I see monarchs? Ah, I see a bit of orange. I see clusters. I'm going to start counting. I'm going to see what is here this year. And this is what monitors now get to see. And this is what our state park public is also viewing, this awesome phenomena at Bodega Dunes, Natural Bridges, Pismo, Morrow Bay State Parks. Everyone is getting monarch mania. Okay, Western Monarch Count volunteers follow protocol and are trained. This ensures good data for docents, the media, scientists, and land managers. Our tools have evolved. We enter our counts via smartphone, but we are still in the field. We still use binoculars. We also can't get enough. We record sightings on iNat. We participate in BioBlitzes, the monarch larval monitoring program. We enter on Journey North, and we help fill identified data gaps by stepping up for the Monarch Mystery Challenge. I was really happy that Heather mentioned the many, many resources on the Xerces westernmonarchcount.org website. You can look at interactive maps, you can see trends, you can look at the training videos, you can see what the monitors are seeing. It's a treasure trove of information, and they make it better each year. We know this will help guide work and research on impacts on climate change, on monarch populations, and help our further understanding of the different complexities that continue to come up in our monarch world. But here's the best news. Monarchs thrive in our state parks. Our count data documents that 12 of the top 50 sites are in state parks. A third of the overwintering monarchs may find refuge in state parks. And what a thrill to know that it is in the state parks where the public visits that interaction happens, where that sense of wonder and curiosity and wanting to help grows through signage, tours, youth programs, seeing monarch volunteers in action in so many ways. And who doesn't want to see more of that picture on the far left corner? Young people learning about monarchs, taking the pledge, making monarch wings so he can fly and join the monarchs in the beauty of nature. Okay, early on, we learned that a chance to see that what was really the most exciting is that visiting state parks is a chance to see state parks at their best through viewing monarchs. We see the state parks offering hope through protection, education, and stewardship, and be like a monitor, see the real thing. So thanks, Randy, for inviting me to share just how special community science is, how much we're contributing to helping all of you do good work in the state parks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mia and Heather. It's amazing. It's amazing what volunteers and citizen scientists can do, and all that leadership that you've provided in Xerces and state parks to support volunteers doing all this great work. If you go to Natural Bridges, you'll see docents leading tours, and it's a wonderful part of what makes state parks so special. So thank you, Mia. Our final speaker is Bill Henry. Dr. Henry is the director of Groundswell Coastal Ecology, and he has over 30 years experience in conservation biology, restoration ecology, and wildlife research on sensitive species throughout Western North America. He co-authored the recent monarch butterfly overwintering site management plans for Natural Bridges and Lighthouse Field state beaches. And these plans are informing and prioritizing conservation actions that will be protecting overwintering monarchs at our state parks for future generations. Bill Henry is also my go-to. If I ever have any questions, he's always out in the field, but he picks up my calls. He's just a treasure trove of knowledge and wisdom. So Bill, thank you for joining us, and please share some of the work that you're doing.
All right, I'm so excited to be here with you all. I'm very grateful. Good to see so many people. And yeah, it is so incredible how monarchs are this, like, you know, this micro charismatic species that pull people in. They bring people together, right? And they encourage us to do good on the landscape, which benefits them and ourselves. So yeah, I direct Groundswell Coastal Ecology, and we make places better for nature and people, and really understand that we are part of the ecosystem and have a responsibility to promote biodiversity and resilience throughout the landscape that we are very much a part of. And I think that California State Parks Foundation recognizes that by connecting people and parks. And we've been working with the foundation, California State Parks Foundation, and state parks resource managers and interpreters to manage monarch overwintering sites in the Santa Cruz State Parks District. And we began by working with Fish and Wildlife and Xerces almost a decade ago to write the first Western monarch overwintering site management plan for Lighthouse Field. And that kind of was just an evolution of circumstance. We were doing coastal restoration near the site and wondered maybe we could do something to help the monarchs as well. And I happened to sit next to Samantha Markham, who is runs the Western the monarch program for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife for the Western monarch populations. And so it's been really neat to see this kind of this ballooning of conservation awareness and action around monarchs since. It's just an exponential curve there. And so we've since worked with others including the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts and our local Santa Cruz Resource Conservation Districts, and a whole host of others to develop several management plans, including the iconic sites at Natural Bridges. And these plans try and focus on what we can do to help monarchs at overwintering sites. And this is like, as Heather mentioned, this is a part of their ecology in their annual phenology that is very important. And so the overwintering sites are a safe place for monarchs to undergo diapause. And this is a suspended state of development, right? This is when they're hitting the pause button to let everything pass, the winter pass, and for them to emerge and to continue on their generational migratory pathways. And it's a place where monarchs are not susceptible to mortality, and they can have this low metabolic rate for an extended period where they don't consume valuable fat reserves, which they want to save for leaving the overwintering sites and continuing with their migration to start the next generations again. And so these sites, when we think about the anatomy of a site, what makes a good site, it's really like a shelter with stable conditions. And in the winter here, we have things like winds, right? And it can come from different directions. So we tend to think about in these plans, like, how do we buffer the places where the monarchs cluster and aggregate from these winds of different directions? And what are the components that do that? How do we maintain stable temperatures that, do not subject monarchs to drastic changes, right? Which goes both ways. We can have freezing events, which are hard on monarchs, and you get clusters falling to the ground, right? But we can also have warming events, which wakes monarchs up and makes them fly around and consume valuable resources that they should be saving for breeding and migrating. Some of the other things that we think about are, water availability and rain, and having humidity in the grove and not having this really dry habitat that could, can make them subject to drying out. Other things are, the groves have to have a substrate that they can adhere to, and different leaves allow them to adhere to these, to the grove differently. So like a cypress may have a different function than a eucalyptus tree, which is different than a pine. We also think about things like predators, and this has been a neat segue with the California State Parks Crumb Clean campaign, where we documented species like yellow jackets taking significant numbers of monarchs at Lighthouse Field. And so yellow jackets are supported by how we manage our waste stream, and Crumb Clean is kind of all about that. It's a campaign of state parks to really manage our waste streams. Some of the other things we think about: disturbance from vibration to night light. And let's see, what are some of the other things? Pesticides, having, regulations that limit pesticide use around our groves. These are some of the things that we think about, but really, a lot of what comes back to this place, this overwintering site, is that the grove is a core part of it, and that's a stand of trees, right? And these trees are generally, across much of California, introduced species. So blue gum eucalyptus, Monterey cypress, and Monterey pine. And we're close to Monterey cypress and Monterey pine to their native habitats, but most of the groves are actually not within them. So they're kind of considered an introduced species, which poses a conundrum for parks to manage, because parks manages for, native species for the enjoyment of people. So it's this balance, right, where we want monarchs to thrive, and it's a challenging thing when they use so many invasive species. Let's see. So, but they do also use native species. So in some groves, you can make this transition, by encouraging planting native species to allow them to transition away from maybe some of these introduced species. So the last thing I'd like to say is that managing, like Randy said, when was the best time to plant a tree? It's 20 years ago, yesterday. These groves are not a static thing, they're a dynamic thing. With trees fall and they regrow, and it can be really hard to plan for that. But what plays into part of that is that, parks and these groves have never been managed from a silvicultural perspective. And so if you want to maintain a stand of trees for a long time, their effort goes into that. And I think that that's something that we're kind of grappling with going forward. What kind of effort do we use to manage these groves? And how do other processes play a role in that, like fire, for instance, in creating fire resiliency in these groves? So I could go on forever. I'm going to stop there.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
No, it's the work you've done has been tremendous, and it's kind of one thing in working with state parks for all these years. State parks always works better when they have a plan, and I think these monarch overwintering grove plans are really a critical piece in us being able to use the best science that you've been bringing to it, along with our volunteers, to do great work in monarch conservation. So really appreciate that. You know, I'm looking at all the people, we have people from throughout the state, and the hot topic is milkweed. So I thought maybe, anyone of our panelists who wants to sort of, the questions kind of sum up is sort of, you know, what type of milkweed should be planted, and generally how far from the coast? Is there some general rules of thumb? I mean, I'm sure that there's a bigger conversation, but that we can share with people. I'm seeing people from Los Angeles and Sonoma and all around the place. Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Well, it's kind of easy for me because I'm a proponent of the native and natural landscape and planting the right plant in the right place. So the right plant is a native milkweed and native nectar plants, and in the right place, which is where it once grew. And we don't have records of milkweed growing in the coastal zone, so that would be the inland breeding areas. And so it's kind of simple for me. Of course, this gets more complex if we move to overwintering with, as Bill said, the complexities of eucalyptus, et cetera. But so for those of you out there thinking about milkweed, please plant native for your area or native for California, and please consider native nectar plants if you're along the coast.
I would totally agree with Mia. And it's funny because milkweed usually comes first to mind when we think about helping monarchs. And yes, it is very critical to monarchs. And some of the factors that support milkweed populations include healthy river floodplains throughout their migrational corridors, right? So, and that gets to water and climate change and all sorts of things, but also reducing herbicide intensive monocrop agriculture, where margins of agricultural fields where milkweeds maybe once thrived are now kept barren with herbicides. So how can we replace this lost habitat with things like hedgerows that could be occupied by a diversity of plants, including beneficial insects and other animal species? But California is home to like 18 species of native milkweed. So, you know, looking where those are distributed, there are some common ones that you see in nurseries a lot, like the showy milkweed or the narrow-leafed milkweed, which is found throughout California. The showy is more in Northern California. And there are some that break dormancy early in the spring, like a woolly pod milkweed or a heartleaf milkweed. And others are common to central coastal California, like the California milkweed. But the rule of thumb that we generally use is don't plant milkweeds within 5 miles of the coast, because the monarchs are at, especially around these overwintering sites, the monarchs are here to go into diapause, not to lay their eggs and start a new generation. And so by planting milkweeds, especially the subtropical ones that can survive here, are promoting the wrong type of behaviors. They're basically encouraging what we call kind of like the farmed monarchs, or the farmed salmon version of monarchs, versus the wild salmon of monarchs that we do want to encourage. And the Xerces does have some great resources on their websites. There is also a really neat thing I found by agorahillcity.org. I can put it in the chat, but it showed like the distributions of some of these native milkweeds across the landscape. The trick is milkweeds are a little bit finicky, so having that full diversity is hard to find. So there are a couple winners that get promoted by nurseries and regional conservation groups.
I'm glad you mentioned the diapause and how that's such a critical part of their life cycle. And so thank you for that. Mia, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to share that on the Xerces website, there's some discussion of the big question, why the population decline has been so steep and precipitous. And one is protecting, to put it positively, protecting overwintering sites. The second is enhancing and protecting the inland breeding habitat, which is the expansion of milkweeds, as Bill discussed, and then also the increasing and pervasiveness of pesticides. So we have to have a much healthier environment, and then supporting good science to learn about the relationships of climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And then, so there's kind of a role for everybody to play here. So we've kind of paired the possible causes along with some possible suggestions.
Mm-hmm. I think of it like from San Francisco down to San Diego, like it's 101, Highway 5, the Sierra foothills, like all in those areas. It's so fun to go spotting milkweed in the fields and knowing that our monarchs are headed over there to go get to that milkweed. And we have like Fremont, I think about like Fremont Peak State Park and Indian Grinding Rock State Park are places where I've found native milkweed and monarchs. So that's that whole range expansion that they do. I have a couple of other questions I'm going to start throwing in here. You know, Heather, I just wanted to, you know, you talked a little bit about that, but just in what ways do you feel California State Parks' role in monarch butterfly conservation can be significant?
Yeah, I think, you know, it really comes down to the fact that state parks manages a large number of the overwintering sites on the California coast. And, you know, and I'm really glad that Bill kind of went into a little bit more of the biology of why they overwinter. I mean, it is a significant piece of their annual cycle. You know, they've evolved this strategy for surviving the winter. And like Bill mentioned, they're in reproductive diapause. They're in these groves that tend to be protected from storms and have just the right mix of light and shade and some nearby nectar sources and the mild climate. And like they all cluster together with their friends. Like, I kind of think of it as like their winter retreat. It's like, I mean, I kind of like, I want to go, like, it sounds, sounds pretty nice. And, you know, that, I mean, there are a lot of overwintering sites across the state of California, but overwintering sites have these very specific requirements. And so the fact that state parks manages land that has so many of them means that we really have a critical role. And, you know, specifically with the Western population, you know, we have, as most people know, the monarchs in North America tend to go to Mexico or coastal California. And, you know, we're managing a lot of the sites that the guys headed to coastal California are going to. And that's, I mean, that's pretty important. And I wonder too how important our role will be in climate change, since, you know, we're one land manager that manages land across a pretty broad latitudinal gradient. I mean, we manage overwintering sites in the Sonoma Mendocino Coast District up north, all the way down to the Orange Coast District down south, and a lot of the districts in between. And so, I mean, it'll be interesting. We don't know exactly what the monarchs are going to do with climate change, but there's reason to believe there might be a shift northward. So, you know, us as a land manager who kind of can take what we learn in their more southern part of their range, if they do shift northward, we can take some of that information to our more northerly overwintering sites. So I think state parks definitely has a role to play in the future for the species. So
Yeah, thank you for also mentioning how sort of climate change is really affecting so much of the work that you're doing and that we're really trying to pay attention to. Speaking about change, Amia, and we're going to get to people's questions, and we've really been trying to integrate them. So thank you for keeping to put your questions in, and we'll get to as many as we can. But Mia, just maybe a quick anecdote, or you've been seeing monarch groves for many years, the same monarch groves. So is there any kind of changes that you've observed, or anything that you feel like is just of interest that sort of made you either have a moment to pause or think like, wow, we're really learning something here?
Well, one personal observation is I really believe in the power of place, and I've been visiting the same sites for many years, and like a monarch, I just feel those sites are really, really important. They're often in very beautiful locations. There's a community of caring people. So it really enhances that sense of place to me. And as Rachel Carson says, that sense of hope of following the cycles of the seasons and the larger paths of migration, et cetera, is very, very moving to me. But I kind of remember in the early days that monarchs were just part of the scene, and people were pretty, I don't want to say laissez-faire, because everyone marked the arrival, everyone who saw them were in awe, but they weren't the main focus in most places. And what I've seen now and is so hopeful is what Bill and Heather and you Randy are talking about. These are a main priority. There are assessments, there's restoration plans, there's active work underway, there are signs that people care. And I'm such a student of Rachel Carson. I think that's what motivates people to make the bigger changes in the world and to find a way that we each can do something, is by the changes that we see around us that other people are doing when we know. But for me, that means that I see people like Bill going in and looking closely and coming up with plans and then implementing them. And it's all up and down the state. It's at so many sites, and the monarchs are responding. So as a monitor, I can hardly wait to see that response and to provide data to document what's going on as you make those improvements. So that's kind of what I see, is that connection to place, and then the active work that's happening in the state park lands and the ways we can engage to help that.
Right. And I'm imagining that some of those of you who are in our audience maybe feel the same way that I do. And you mentioned about how, marking the seasons by the monarch's return. And I have to admit that, like 2020, I think I experienced real grief over those declining numbers. It was very hard from a personal level. I mean, we always want to think that, we want to rely on our science, but like our hearts and our minds, if when we see something like the monarchs just collapse like they did, it really changes your sense of your whole identity. And that's really felt that way. And Bill, I was thinking about one of the things that I love about working with you is that you not only look at the monarch, but you look at the whole biodiversity and in the ways of helping monarchs and helping increase biodiversity. Talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go into some other questions from the audience.
Yeah. It is interesting, like the monarchs are they're so emblematic, and we're drawn to them. And they also, supporting them also can support a myriad of other species. So when we do good for monarchs, we can do good for many different species and a whole host, the whole host of characters. But it does again, circle back to some of the conundrum that parks has to work with at the overwintering sites, where a lot of the species that monarchs use, even for nectaring, are Cape ivy and English ivy and eucalyptus, even for for nectaring. And so I think that at some of the actions we do at the overwintering sites have some kind of an exemption status to help monarchs. And I think I've, as being a restoration ecologist, I've resigned myself to that being okay, and we want to do all we can do to help out monarchs right now. But in thinking how we help other species, oftentimes I come back to the fact that monarchs are really wide-ranging migratory species that rely on these healthy contiguous ecosystems that include not only the overwintering sites that we focus on, but also the entire migration corridors that span the length of the Western states and include many state parks, right? Not just these overwintering sites. And, there's many actions that we can do that result in benefits to monarchs and biodiversity in general. And, first and foremost, obviously, actions that we can do to combat climate change, because that just dwarfs everything else, are really important. So important to monarchs and biodiversity and life on Earth as we know it. But it's also important to note that benefits to monarchs also benefit insects. And so insects are declining across the world in the Anthropocene, and this includes sweeping declines in formerly abundant species that are very important to ecosystem function, and the reasons are many. But insects are a key component of ecosystems, and they form a lot of the animal biomass that that links primary producers and consumers, and important food webs in terrestrial systems in freshwater. So insects are really important. So by benefiting monarchs, we're generally benefiting insects. And some of the actions that I think can support monarchs and insect biodiversity are important to countless other species, from plants to mammals. Again, we talked a little bit about milkweed being one thing that you can do that benefits other species, from the fact that, by supporting intact hydrology, for instance, can support milkweed, and that supports a host of species that rely on these wet and riparian areas. We talked a little bit about reducing herbicide-intensive monocrop agriculture, and that's something that benefits a lot of other species as well, including native bees and other pollinators. One thing I think we can do, and this has we've come back to this a bunch, is that grow natives. Native plants are primary producers and form a foundation for biodiversity, for the biodiversity of other species. And we know that many species have complex and long evolved relationships with native plant species. And so by growing native plants, you're supporting this host, from the insects to, the white-crowned sparrow that eats the seed, to the sharp-shinned hawk that nails the white-crowned sparrow. You're supporting all of those. Another thing that we haven't talked about, and that also includes, nectar, seeds, forage for other types of food resources, and then host plants. These native plants are host plants for reproduction of other species as well. But one thing we didn't talk about too much was maintaining intact fire regimes across the landscape. And so supporting things like regular fire intervals. And this is something that parks and California State Parks Foundation are both working on together very intensively. In fact, our California State Parks leads kind of the state in some areas, the Western US, and some of their advanced techniques for maintaining regular fire intervals on the landscape. And this can support the regrowth of flowering plants, from shrubs to annual and perennial forbs that pollinators all use, right? And it increases the availability of nectar and produces fruits and seeds and nuts that are utilized by many species. Kind of along the chemical thing, I think reducing our resilience on neonicotinoid pesticides is a big one that can help other species, so we can transition to crop diversity from monocropping and create habitat that is for beneficial insect predators that help reduce crop pests. And reducing the use of neonicotinoid pesticides is something that California is moving towards, apart from the federal, the US EPA, but the California EPA is moving towards regulation of some of these pesticides in agriculture and in private settings, which is going to be, it's a step in the right direction to helping, a host of other species. The other thing is really conserving water in these riparian areas. By conserving water, we're helping things like milkweed and nectar places. These riparian areas support a diversity of flowering plants that are important to monarchs and other species. And they also really support some of the later blooming nectar plants that monarchs really rely on during their fall and even early spring migration. So, we can reduce our water consumption that leaves water for other species. And then we can also support work that increases percolation and aquifer recharge throughout the landscape that helps keep water in the system and available for a host of other species. So those are some of the actions, I think, kind of on the broader scale that we can do that help monarchs and help overall biodiversity, because it's important not to be myopic and just think
Right.
about one thing.
One thing.
Yeah.
So I want to get to some of the questions that are from the audience. One is, I guess there's some pretty extreme winds that are predicted to happen. And, how do the monarchs do in those extreme winds? Mia, maybe when you're out there monitoring, or Heather, maybe you've heard from the field, like, are we seeing dramatic effects on our groves and our monarch populations with these high winds?
So we urge our monitors to go out after a storm event, which could be rain or a big wind, and see how the monarchs are faring, how the overwintering sites have done their job offering refuge, look at dead monarchs, etc. So that's part of our documentation through completing a habitat assessment. But a grove that does its job and has the requirements Bill was describing of tree placement, canopy, etc., does its job and protects the monarchs from the high winds. And we hope the migrants have made it there. There's also autumnal sites along the way where monarchs can hunker down when it's really hot or really cold or high winds or smoky. Those don't get quite as much attention, but they're really important as rest stops along the way, along the migratory path till they can get to the overwintering sites. So that bigger picture of protection that Bill was describing and many state parks offer is really, really important. I get so many beautiful accounts from people that they were camping at, let's say, Mono Lake, and they woke up and a tree was covered with monarchs, and those of course were on the migratory path over one of the passes to the coast. People just feel like heaven's descended upon them. It's amazing when that happens. So that's part of why we're also looking at how monarchs fare with these clues of climate change, which could be temperature extremes, high winds, unusual storm events. And that's what monitoring does, helps out to understand what's going on for others to feed into restoration work, etc.
Are we seeing any evidence with drought? Oh, well, Heather, maybe you had something to add to that, please.
I just wanted to add that really when we're looking at these overwintering groves, the definition of the overwintering site is so much more than just the clustering core area. That is an important piece of the larger overwintering site, but really a significant part of it is what we've been calling the shelter zone. It's more the protective zone around that tends to be trees that can block the wind and a lot of the storm from, whichever the prevailing wind direction is. So that is super important. So when we're talking about overwintering sites, we're talking about a lot more than just the core where the butterflies are clustering, because they need this additional protection.
Yeah, the photo that I shared with the before and after, a lot of those trees were, right, they're beyond the clustering area, but they create sort of that, they dampen the wind so that these wind events have less of a effect on the monarchs. One of the questions was about drought. Are we seeing any effects of drought right now on groves? I see Bill's shaking his head, Mia.
You want to go ahead, Mia?
Well, I just wanted to say that so many of the groves, especially the eucalyptus groves, are showing drought stress, signs of mortality, which of course increases our concern about fuels, hazard trees, etc. So we're seeing that in so many of the groves.
Yeah, that's definitely what we've seen, in the Santa Cruz area in Central California. Drought is a tough one. It impacts tree health. And we see limb loss fairly frequently. There's not as much turgor in the trees, and so they're just drying out and they will drop limbs. It also increases susceptibility to pests such as the eucalyptus tortoiseshell beetle and the eucalyptus longhorn borer, and we see more evidence of that. And that happens, that those species also attack these recently dropped limbs. So that's actually one of the things California State Parks Foundation and California State Parks has helped do, is remove those limbs from the grove when they do fall. Although, if you remove all the dead stuff, then you're kind of opening things up more. And there's just this balance, like how park-like do we want it, and how do we maintain enough density and canopy coverage to help protect the wind. We also see an increase in root rot, and that happens with drought, and you do get tree toppling then, especially combined with, if it's been dry for a while and then you get a rain, the roots have probably, the roots have, there's been some rot in the system, all of a sudden there's rain, the soil's really saturated, and then trees get toppled over in these winds. And so drought is a really tough one, and I think that's something that we're hoping to explore more locally with the California State Parks Foundation, to put together kind of these watershed analysis around these groves, like where can we increase percolation into the shallow water aquifer to help support these groves, these stands of trees, which are so critical.
We're getting to time, but one really just, and I have a couple closing statements, but one of the great questions, what are the best and most needed ways to volunteer or protect and monitor monarchs? Maybe go around the panel and kind of the final thought of, well, what are the best things that people can do to help monarchs right now? Heather, you want to maybe start, and Bill and Mia?
Yeah, I would say, the citizen science projects that they have at Xerces are phenomenal. And a lot of the information that we have about our overwintering sites and number of monarchs that they're supporting, it's coming directly from the count volunteers, and, that Mia is heavily involved with. So, I think that's huge. And then definitely, contact your local state parks, nonprofit foundations. We have a lot of them across the state, and they can help you. They can help set you up with volunteer opportunities in the parks for sure.
Thank you.
I totally agree. The citizen science is really helping us to learn more about monarchs. And one of the things that we don't know is kind of where these really important first stopovers are. And so that can be a place where we can concentrate, say, milkweed planting. And so there are some apps for documenting where you observe monarchs, and that information gets put into databases that help identify some of those sites. So that's an important thing. I think also planting pollinator gardens in your own yard, using native plants and species that bloom at times when the monarchs need them, like early spring and fall in our area. And that's very, very helpful.
Thank you, Bill. Mia, final thought?
Well, I just want to underscore how invaluable the various volunteers at the state parks are. When I go to the state parks with monarch overwintering sites, I see docents, I see people doing stewardship work. I know they go out to schools. I see art projects. I see community activism. And I want to underscore a point that Bill made a bit ago in the chat, which is this is a very exciting time to be involved with monarchs. And one reason is how much we are learning every day, keeping up. And the science is evolving and helping us understand how to be helpful. So it's really exciting, but whether it's the Xerxes Society or your state park volunteers or Monarch joint venture, there's lots of ways to keep up with it. And that's really important.
All right. Well, that's wonderful words. I'm so thankful for Heather, Bill, and Mia for joining us, and all of you from across the state. I was reading your comments, and it was so wonderful to hear that. Hear that everybody cares so much, and to hear some of the things you're doing. We're collecting questions. We will start to get questions back out to you. I think that there's a few things just Giving Thursday, and we're running a campaign. So if you want to help Monarchs by donating, you can get your gift doubled. So that's another way you can help out. And let's keep this conservation going. This is a important initiative from California State Parks Foundation. We're in it for the long haul. And we want to continue working with Heather, Bill, and Mia, as well as others, to continue to support their efforts. And we feel so thankful to have so many incredible donors and supporters like all of you who showed up. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your day, and enjoy your fall and winter. Take care. All right, bye team. Thank you.